All right. So I think it's broadcasting now.
Okay. So basically, the topic for today is that happiness is not in possessions, but in practices. And as we know, happiness is basically certain neurotransmitters in our brain, like dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, and so on. So we want to normally use outside world as an excuse to feel good. So, for example, if you have more money, you will feel better, or if you have more status, you will feel better. But in reality, there are some simple, free practices that anyone can do that will boost happiness, and it's scientifically proven. Stuff like deliberate gratitude, taking good care of your physical health, so exercise, good diet, um, meditation, cultivating compassion, forgiveness, kind of cleaning those negative emotions, letting them go, and then focusing on appreciating what we already have, focusing on creating inspiring visions of the future, and let's say doing creative visualization. So our lives could be much simpler, and there could be less stress, there could be more contact with nature, and we don't need that much money to be happy. And a good example of that is, for example, monks who don't have possessions, and they basically just all day long practice those practices that I just mentioned. And one of those monks has been called by scientists the happiest person on earth after doing some brain scans that revealed that he is basically like perpetual state of bliss after
Yeah,
like 40 years of meditation or so.
French Tibetan monk.
Yeah, exactly. So that's my new insight that maybe because of the culture, because of the advertisers that are trying to push us to buy more stuff, they are creating the narrative that you are not good enough and you don't have enough. And if you just buy the new product, then you will be allowed to be happy. But so far, no. And there are those covers of the magazines with photoshopped models, and if you don't look exactly like that, you don't deserve to feel happy, and you don't deserve to feel good about yourself, and so on. So we are programmed by society to not feel happy and to look for happiness in things that are pricey, or some status symbols, like you need to finish your degree and you need to get a good job and you need to get the house, and only then you're allowed to be happy. But it never comes because we get used to whatever we achieve or whatever we possess. So we end up just chasing happiness instead of focusing on the fact that in the now we could experience it today with a few simple practices and just changing the paradigm, the mindset, how we perceive what we already have. So there's this amazing quote that abundance can be had by just consciously accepting and receiving what has already been given to us. So we have already enough to be happy, and we are enough to be happy. So
Okay,
what
all
do
right.
you think
So let
about
me just so you said a lot of things. So first of all, you're saying it's not about possessions, it is about practices. You're saying these possessions are not necessary for happiness. There are certain um, practices that can bring us happiness even if we don't have these possessions. And you're saying that society makes us want those possessions, while really it should be those practices that could bring us happiness. And some of those practices that you mentioned were gratitude, were meditation, were forgiveness, vision of the future. I think you also mentioned good nutrition and exercise. Okay, so one quick observation. A month ago, we had a call about effortless work,
it?
and in that call, you said effortless work is basically about two things. One, deciding, finding an area of work that you really like, and two, having certain practices that make the
Mm-hmm.
work effortless. And you mentioned meditation, mindfulness, good nutrition,
Mm-hmm.
exercise, and it seems that
Mm-hmm.
those
Mm-hmm.
things that would lead to effortless work also would lead to happiness.
They would.
Okay. Now, the question that I have is several. So, number one, do you think that it is society that makes us want those possessions? Or do you think it might be nature that naturally, even without the influence of society, makes us want those possessions?
I think it's largely society, because if you look at, let's say, tribes that live, hunter-gatherer tribes, they don't necessarily desire a new Tesla, or I don't know. We started as the species, living in those tribes, and no one had any possessions. We were moving in the herd around. We couldn't carry too many things, so we didn't have them. Possessions started as a thing with agriculture about 12,000 years ago. So it's a new thing, evolutionarily speaking. So while we do want to be fed, and we don't want to be hungry and all of that, I think it's quite new for humanity to require all those possessions. And we do have some biological mechanisms that definitely make it work. That yes, we are always choosing more instead of less if we have a choice. But the focus on that comes, I think, also from agriculture.
Okay. Uh, I partly agree with it in the sense that if you look at primitive tribes, even nowadays, they might not desire a Tesla because they don't know about a Tesla, and they don't have the desire because their friends don't have a Tesla. But I do think that the desire for possessions and the desire for status and the desire to differentiate yourself from others and to be better than others and to get a certain status by possessions, I think that is something that is ingrained in us naturally. And you can look at animals and you can see that a lot of animals have it, that they are, say, some birds are gathering a lot of stuff to make themselves or the nest look very beautiful, so that the males do that. So that the female comes, looks at it, and says, "Wow, what a nice nest. Okay, I'm gonna be your mate." So I think something similar we have it programmed into us to want to gather these possessions because those possessions help us in reproduction, and reproduction is the only thing that nature, evolution cares about. So you can also see this when tribes, even primitive tribes, when they see jewelry, they want to put on jewelry. They want to differentiate themselves. So you can see those tribes that have their own tribal jewelry to differentiate themselves. And they would want to have this jewelry, and they would pay a lot. That would be very valuable, even though it doesn't have any real utility except for the way that you look. So I do think that this is something ingrained in us, and it's not the society's fault. It's society's fault, maybe, as you mentioned, to give us the illusion that this is what we are supposed to have, to give us the image, that the vision that this is possible, that people that we see on social media or that we see in the overall media are people that are happy, rich, have a lot of possessions, and so we feel, yes, we should have the same. But I do think that, so this is it makes them stronger, but the drive to have possessions is there naturally in us because this is what nature wants. Would you agree?
Okay, that's a very interesting point. Actually, you're saying that it's for reproduction, but it's also for survival, potentially, right? Some animals, like bees, for example, create honey so that they can survive the winter and so on. So there are some of those mechanisms, and I do agree that certain level of that is true. But also there is something called self-expression, where we seek artistic expression, maybe to show our uniqueness, our true self. That's definitely there as well. But I do believe also that because of advertising, if you compare, for example, lives during communism, where there was no advertising and there was really no possessions to be had, like everyone had pretty much the same status and so on, people were a little bit different. People were a little bit more relaxed about owning, and maybe they weren't chasing that many things that much, because there is a part of the default kind of wants, and then there is the part of manufactured things. There's like needs and wants, right, in marketing. So you need shelter and food and clothes, but you desire an iPad. And these are the not necessary things, but they make you believe that you need those things. So it's interesting, even like if you go to Cuba, for example, or somewhere where there's no advertising, brainwashing people 24/7, thousands of messages of marketing all the time, people can potentially be happy because they have good relationships, because they have some food, they can dance, those things fulfill them. And there's always tighter community in those communist countries, for example, because it needs to be to survive, one of the reasons, because the state doesn't function well, but it's also people are not chasing the possessions so much because they're more happy with simple things.
Okay. All right. So I would summarize, and I agree with you, that on the one hand, we have nature that makes us want certain things. But on the other hand, we also have society that might make us want those things more. And while most people would say what they want is happiness, in their action, they're not doing what would make them happy, but they are, as you say, many times pursuing certain possessions or certain status, which they would then say is because they're looking for happiness, but in fact, this is not what's really making them happy. Now, if it's because of society indoctrinates them to search for that, or if it's because nature puts a program into us for reproductive purposes that we want that, it doesn't really matter that much. I think what matters is to realize that this is not what's making us happy. And so for us, I think the most important thing, I think for anybody, if the goal is happiness, is to realize what are the things that really make us happy. And so we can start with saying many of the things that people are pursuing do not make them happy, especially material possessions, as you mentioned. And there are certain things that can make us happy that are very simple. Like you said, gratitude exercise, meditation, forgiveness exercise, good nutrition, and physical exercise. And the question for me is now, what other things are required for happiness? Is it only those things, or are there other things that make us happy?
Well, there's more, obviously, like connection, community, belonging, nature. I think we live right now in a very unnatural way. We're not designed to be sitting in front of the computer, for 8 hours at work, and then for 6 hours later, and then being on the phone in the meantime, spending all our waking hours in front of screens, indoors, removed from nature, not moving, and so on. So there are a lot of problems. And another thing is the distractions, the dopamine traps that we use now, which is either social media or all kinds of things that give us instant kick of dopamine, which could be also food. People are addicted to sweets and so on. So if we remove the person from all of that noise and we put them into some more natural environment and they calm down and their dopamine levels normalize and so on, I think people can be much happier that way. And the tragedy is that most people have never experienced how happy they could have been if they used all those practices. So we can look at monks, for example, and we can be like, those people are crazy. How can they live like this? But have you actually done the practices that they do, and have you felt how it feels? Because what if that feels 10 times better than your current routine, right? That's the interesting question. What do you think?
Okay, all right, okay. So we can say that nature and society has programmed us in a way that we want to seek certain things which do not make us happy, even though most people would say that happiness is the number one objective. So now the question for us is, what things do we need to do for us to be happier? And a good example is monks, where you can measure the happiness and you can see they're doing things which most people would say is crazy. They're not pursuing any material possessions. They're meditating, but then you see their happiness. So if people were really rationally pursuing happiness, then maybe you should look at the people that are the happiest, maybe those Buddhist monks, and do the same thing as they are doing. So what are those things? So we mentioned some practices, as you mentioned, gratitude, meditation, forgiveness, the vision of the future, good nutrition, and physical exercise. And you also mentioned belonging, community, relationship, and trying to avoid information overload and being uh, in with nature. So what other things can we gather of things that make us happy? I would add sunshine. I would add
Yes.
getting enough sleep. So
Yes.
just lifestyle choices. Not overworking, not working 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. So taking breaks. Um, what
Anything
else?
that increases your energy levels, basically. Because energy is happiness in a way. Like when you feel super energetic, you usually feel happy, and when you are depressed, you have usually no energy. So even things like breathing exercises or um, green tea or whatever can boost your level of energy, cold showers or something, right? Will contribute to happiness, I think.
Okay, so let's take a look at those people that are doing all of that and they're still not happy. So, for example, you have a person that has a community of friends that is doing the forgiveness exercise, the gratitude exercise, meditating, doing physical exercise, eating healthy in the sun, in nature. Now, he probably would not be depressed, but let's say he is depressed. Then what else could this person do? He comes to you and he says, "Look, I'm depressed. What do I do?" So, what would you say?
I think finding some sort of purpose in your life, some sort of alignment between what you do well and between what you love doing and something that can serve other people and you can see the impact that you're making, that's an important part as well, would definitely be helpful because it's not only about pleasures, but it's also about meaning. So sometimes doing the hard thing, that uncomfortable thing, the thing that stretches your comfort zone will bring the most fulfillment in the long run as well. But I don't believe that there are many depressed people in the tribes, living in nature, in hunter-gatherer societies, for example. Depression is usually the disease of the rich Western societies. Even in poor countries, it's rare to find people depressed. They're too busy striving for survival, but also they have those tight communities, and those communities also make them feel not lonely, and it helps as well, I think. What do you think?
Yes, I do agree. I think we need to make a distinction between sadness or feeling bad and depression. So depression for me is something not only like feeling bad, but it's a feeling bad which not necessarily is justified. For example, um, uh, I have a child and I see my child being run over by a car and die. Well, I'm gonna feel bad about it. That's natural. Um, and I don't have anything to eat, and my kids don't have anything to eat. My kids are dying because they don't have anything to eat. It's natural to feel bad about that. So I do think that you can be sad about it, but still not be depressed. So I would say depression is when there's really no real reason that you should feel bad and you still feel bad.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say yes. If depression is designed that defined that way, then this is something of the civilized society, and it doesn't really exist in in non-civilized, more primitive societies. However, what I do think exists there is also sadness, because for those reasons that I just mentioned. Just
Yes.
if you're not able to get enough to drink, to eat, there's war, you're gonna feel bad about it, and it's not because you're
Mm-hmm.
depressed; you're gonna feel bad about it. So, and in those instances, trying to achieve more, trying to have more possessions, trying to have enough to survive, trying to have enough water, food, and maybe being able to get good education, being able to work in something that you like, is something that I think makes sense for those people.
Yes.
So I would say when we're talking about that society and nature might not give us the right incentives to be happy, and many people are pursuing possessions, and this is not the right way to become happy. I think that's true if we're talking about the maybe 30% of the population, maybe 50%, somewhere there, which is well off. If you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about the least advantaged population on Earth, I think for them it makes total sense to strive to improve their life. Maybe also having possessions meaning not a Ferrari, but
Yeah.
just having a basic good food, good water, education, maybe a job that they actually enjoy
Mm-hmm.
in order for them to feel happier. Wouldn't
For
you?
sure. So you were talking basically about those needs, those basic human needs of
Yes.
like safety and shelter and food. And I agree. But if we look at the Western world, literally pretty much everyone gets that. Like no one is starving to death in Europe, in European Union right now. There are food banks there, there's whole social security net and so on. So once we have that, if you have enough to eat and if you have your clothes and if you have where to sleep, then you could be super happy, kind of instead of looking outside of you, looking within and changing the perspective and changing the focus and changing the meaning that you attach to different things in your life and counting your blessings instead of just looking at what is still missing and the ad said that you should have it anyway.
I agree, and I think it's interesting to look at where we have the strive for possessions, for material wealth the most. And I would argue that those countries which you mentioned, which have been in that situation for a long period of time, of basically a very strong social net, where nobody can be in a situation where they have to struggle for survival or struggle for decent survival, like, for example, the Northern European countries, Scandinavian countries, I would argue that the strive for material possessions are much less in those things, and other things, let's say sustainability, community, is much more valued. While I would argue that, especially in those countries where people are coming up from poverty to have better life, let's say China, Southeast Asia,
Mhm.
also Latin America, materialism is much stronger because people come from a poor background. They don't feel secure. They feel they need more, and so even once they're achieving more, they still want to have more because that's the way that they or their parents um, were brought up, or they were in situations where that was important for their happiness.
That's very true. Exactly. And there's this very funny phenomenon. If you look at it, rich people like, I don't know, Bill Gates, he would be wearing normal clothes and just, be kind of modest about it. Whereas you have some people in Asia who are wearing a lot of gold, or you have people in Russia who are also like wearing a lot of
Oh
gold, trying to
yeah,
show off. It is very interesting. It has something to do also with level of consciousness and development, and whether your local community valued intellectual values as well as material or just the material. Because I know that in some of those less developed places, the fact that you're smart or that you're educated or that you read books doesn't really count in society. But if you have a golden chain, you are the king of the village, right? So that's what people strive for.
okay. So let us make a quick summary of what we discussed so far. So uh, we said that your assumption was that it's sometimes easier to achieve happiness by doing certain regular practices than by having more possessions. And while many people strive for that because of social as well as natural programming, um, it makes us many times happier to go for those practices like gratitude, physical exercise, good nutrition, meditation, and mindfulness, right? So then we were
Mhm.
talking about certain other things besides those practices that are important for our happiness. So we can say that nature does not want to make us happy. Society programming is also not what leads to happiness. So what we should design is the best strategy for us to become happy. So there are certain practices that we mentioned. I would say this generally it's lifestyle related. It is getting enough sleep, being out in nature, doing regular physical exercise, good nutrition, getting breaks. All of this having to do with the lifestyle, I feel, is the first thing that needs to be done
Mm-hmm.
to be happy. Many people suffer sadness or depression because they don't take care of that aspect. Now, what we also saw is that if you're really badly off, you don't have enough to eat, you don't have enough to have a good education, then maybe it makes sense to strive for possessions, even material possessions, just to get a little bit higher, to have the basic.
Mm-hmm.
So improving the life situation is something that maybe for us is no longer so important, but I believe for somebody who is very poor is also important to increase their happiness. So what other areas can we define which are important in the recipe for happiness?
It has a lot to do with the way we think, our patterns of thinking and feeling that we are immersed in every day. And it
Okay.
has a lot to do with how we interpret the reality, right?
Okay. So I think that's exactly what I thought about thoughts. Because basically happiness is an emotion, and it's hard to program yourself directly to become happier. It's not like, okay, now I want to be happy, and you're happy. It's hard to do. What is easier to do is to change your thoughts. And I believe in most cases, when we're happy, when we're sad, there's certain thoughts that accompany that happiness or sadness. So if we are able to change our thoughts from thoughts that make us sad to thoughts that make us happy, then we're going to be happy. So now the question is, how do we do this? How can we change our thoughts to be happier thoughts?
I think we need to realize that we are always filtering reality. So we could be paying attention to so many different things, but we choose to put our laser of attention, which is very small, on this thing and not that thing. And when we think about this, we don't think about that. So what we think about is very important. But the second thing is the way we think about it. Are we looking to appreciate that, or are we looking to say that it's not enough, or we don't have enough, or someone else has more? So the story that we tell ourselves about what we're analyzing at the moment through the laser of our brain is equally important. So what you pay attention to, what meaning you assign to it. And that's why gratitude exercise is such a great thing, because it immediately puts your attention on what you have and what works in your life. And then the interpretation of that comes that you appreciate it, you're thankful for that. So it produces happiness quite rapidly. Within minutes, you feel so much better.
Okay. What I also feel is that we should probably differentiate from just saying overall happiness or overall sadness to certain qualitative differences in different happiness emotions or sadness emotions. So, for example, if I think about sadness or negative emotions, I think it's not only general sadness. I would say that there is envy. I would say there's jealousy, which
Mhm.
doesn't feel comfortable. I would say there's anger, which is also a negative emotion. I would say there is regret as another negative emotion, and I would also be able to identify several positive emotions besides just general happiness, like for example an emotion of love, an emotion
Mhm.
of looking forward to something positive, or in, as you say, gratitude, which is basically realization of you well off, or thinking about a past thing that happened, which is positive. Um, of course, you can think about euphoria and euphoric moments, or the orgasm, the pleasure you get from an orgasm. These are all positive emotions, and I think it's too qualitative different to all categorize them under one
Mhm.
happiness or one sadness. So for me,
Mhm.
the question would be, how can we get more of those positive emotions, and how can we get less of those negative emotions? And I think for each emotion, be it negative or positive, the recipe is different.
Exactly. You mentioned the word recipe. I was about to say that there is literally like a recipe, and we can recognize the patterns of thought and emotion that follow. And most of people live every day like the previous day. So we kind of live in the past in terms of our habits of thinking and feeling, and then we live in the same environment, which triggers the same thoughts, which trigger the same emotions on the daily basis. So there's this book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, exactly how to break out of this vicious circle. Sometimes by changing the environment, it also helps, so that the same things that were annoying you every day will not annoy you anymore or something by default, because you're in a different environment. But it's also about consciously making some time to cultivate new ways of thinking. So that's why, for example, guided meditation with creative visualization is so powerful, because you take that time each day to imagine yourself in this perfect scenario and to feel it, and that starts rewiring your brain, and then you become a little bit a different person with everything that you do, and you start kind of showing your subconscious how your life should look like, and then your subconscious tries to kind of bend reality so that it follows that vision.
Okay. All right. So we talked about recipe for happiness. Recipe for happiness involving lifestyle changes, implementing certain regular practices, involving maybe a change in the life situation, especially if you are very poor, to improve your life situation. And we talked about being able to change your thought or your thoughts or your thought patterns. What other changes could we make? I would see that the most direct change would be to our brain chemistry, because
Mm-hmm.
the emotion of happiness, or of happiness emotions like looking forward, love, orgasm, all of that is chemistry in our brain. So if we could just directly stimulate our brain to feel the happiness emotions, or we could take drugs that produce that, then we can achieve happiness. What do you think about that? Because some people would say, well, cocaine makes me happy, so let me just take cocaine because then I'm going to be happy. What
Mm-hmm.
would be your response?
The funny part is that you can produce all of the same or very similar experiences that drugs would give you without them. So even the state of flow, for example, when you're so engaged in something, you forget about the whole world. Uh, your brain chemistry is similar during flow as if you took all the drugs known to man. Basically, all of those happy neurotransmitters are present in your system. So, during meditation as well, there are practices that create similar levels of neurotransmitters that drugs do. And I would also add that it's really valuable to experiment. If you hear that, for example, meditation is so good, then finding the right way for you to meditate, which is not that easy because everyone goes to YouTube, says, types how to meditate, and they're like, oh, try to not think about anything for an hour. And it's like so impossible for them to do. But if there's, let's say, a guided meditation where you just lie down, close your eyes, follow the thing, you have some binaural beats with that, it's effortless meditation, and it brings results as well. So finding out about ways to increase your happiness naturally, and then experimenting with that in your life, and then seeing what works for you and what sticks with you, and then implementing that as a part of your daily routine can be absolutely life transformative, because some things you will find that are better for you, some things will maybe not work for you, but once you have those that work and once you put them into the routine, into every day, then you are on the trajectory to be happier and happier and happier. Your level of consciousness will be growing as well.
Okay, but still, even I might say either these practices are too much hassle, or that I'm doing
Mhm.
these practices and they still don't have any effect. So I want to be happy, so I want to take cocaine all the time. What would you say?
Well, you have to look at the consequences as well, right? So it's personal decision of everyone who what they do with their lives. But it happens that people who do it for a long time might have much more unhappiness in their lives.
Exactly.
Uh,
So that's one of the things I wanted to get to, which is that we need to, when we say we want to be happy, what is it actually that we mean? Because I could have sex many times a day, without doing any work, and that could make me happy in the instant, but
Mm-hmm.
does it lead to long-term happiness? Or I could take drugs and would feel great in the instant, but it might not lead to long-term happiness. So
Mm-hmm.
I think we're talking about long-term happiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about happiness, how to achieve happiness. Now the question, of course, is what do we want in terms of happiness? For example, do we want to have a life where we have, say, 1,000 moments of extreme happiness and euphoria, but the 90% of our life being kind of gray uh, and not so interesting and not so happy? Or would we like to have a life without those euphoric moments, the breath, take the breath away, but have a constant level of higher happiness? So, or does it matter for us if we have a great happiness in the last 5 years of our life, but not at the life before? Or do we just prefer to have 50 years of happiness and then maybe 30 years of unhappiness? So what is it that we're actually looking for? And then do we look for happiness only while we're conscious? Or are we looking for happiness while also be unconscious? Because 1/3 of our life we spend unconsciously. We're sleeping. So if 1/3 of our life is unconscious, people don't really think about happiness while they're sleeping. But if that's taken into consideration, if that time also counts for happiness or unhappiness, then it's very important to be able to strive for happiness while we're sleeping. And maybe the techniques to achieve happiness while we're sleeping is different from those techniques that are needed for happiness while we are awake.
That's
So
a
what
very
is
interesting thing.
So what is it that we're looking for when we're talking about we want happiness? What is that you, for example,
Mm-hmm.
personally mean if you want happiness, what
Mm-hmm.
is it that you're actually looking for?
Actually, I think that if you use those practices, you start rewiring your brain permanently, because neurons that fire together, wire together, and so on. So your brain has different settings later for happiness and unhappiness. So you will experience pretty much life in many different ways, always on the higher level of happiness. Like this monk that we discussed, he completely rewired his brain. So then whatever happens, he's, for example, looking for good in it. So life doesn't happen to him, it happens for him. It's like anything that happens is for him to grow, for him to enjoy. If you start looking at it like that, then even your failures, even some tragedy, is an opportunity to grow. And I think
Okay,
you can
but
progressively be happier. In That's what I'm kind of looking for.
okay, but now, basically, you're saying you didn't define exactly what you're looking for when I ask you what is that you're looking for when you say happiness, but basically you're saying it doesn't matter that much because whatever kind of happiness I want, it would be achieved by those practices,
Yeah.
right? Okay. Now, one question came up when you were talking about this monk that has the highest level of happiness. And you were saying that the Buddhist monks achieve the highest level of happiness, and for you, its purpose is to achieve happiness. Then my question would be, why are you not following the steps? Why are you not doing the same thing as this French monk
Hmm.
living in Tibet and follow him, go to Tibet, become a monk, give up your business, and just be a monk?
Hmm.
What's stopping you from doing that? Because you're basically saying that
Hmm.
you think that this person, that these people are probably happier than you. So in
Hmm.
terms of happiness, probably they would be better than what they're doing is probably better than what you're doing right now. So why don't you just follow them? Is there anything that's
Well,
stopping them?
yeah. So here's the deal. I believe that you don't have to be located in Tibet and you don't have to be Buddhist in order to rewire your brain. And I do meditate about an hour a day. So yeah, I am
Whoa!
incorporating more
Dude.
and more, yeah, more and more of the practices. And I do the gratitude exercise and I do the cold showers and I start experimenting with a lot of different things and seeing how they feel. And I'm experiencing some amazing times, also experiencing with breathing from Wim Hof, like hyperoxygenation of the brain, or even like going for a run in the morning, which also oxygenates you a lot. And then your brain chemistry goes like crazy. You are on this runner high and so on. So I do experiment with all of that. And you literally don't have to be in Tibet and you don't have to be a monk to kind of reap the benefit of it.
Okay.
There is this researcher, Sonia Lubomirski from Stanford, that's doing, research on people who are taking part in her studies who are getting the same results through gratitude, for example.
Where do you rate your current happiness on a level of 1 to 10? 10 being the highest.
I think right now it's about the highest that I've had in my life. That's the easier way to say it. I don't know the ratings like that. It's not that quantifiable, but I think recently I've stumbled into like much better levels,
Okay, and now let's assume your business tomorrow fails. Your business partner told you your business failed. Let's assume also that an ex-girlfriend of you puts acid in your face and you're totally disfigured. And you're not able to walk anymore. So let's assume you have all these bad things happen to you. Do you think during the next year you would have the same happiness because you're continuing your gratitude practice and the other exercise? You're eating healthy, doing physical exercise? Or do you actually think that those things financially as well as physically and have an impact on your emotions, on your happiness?
It's hard to say. It's hard to predict your happiness in the future, but I can tell you this. I remember when I was a child, let's say I was 5 years old, I lived in communist Poland, and there was not much stuff. I was so happy doing super simple things like, building some dams on the river or the stream or something, or like playing soccer, or the basic things, or reading books, and I'm still super enjoying these very simple things. So as long as I'm able to enjoy them and appreciate them, I think I could be fine, yeah.
Okay. All right, Sebastian, great discussion. One final question that I have for you is, since you lived in communism and you've traveled a lot, and we talked about that society does not give us a blueprint for happiness, our society we're living in, the Western society. Do you feel that another economic or political system could lead to more happiness than what we have in the West?
Potentially, but I don't think we found it yet. So all the systems that we know have pluses and minuses, and it's fascinating to watch the differences, like where does the system place emphasis on, right? And definitely productivity and money is very important in capitalistic systems. But then you look at Scandinavian countries that are kind of blending things, and China is kind of blending things as well in their own way. So it's interesting. But even living in the capitalistic society, you don't have to subscribe to that kind of ideology of you need to always consume more. You can be the monk in capitalism. No one is going to bother you about it. So I think capitalism is good enough for that, right?
So we discussed a lot of things, Sebastian. How would you summarize today's call? What were the most important ideas?
I think you are the better one in summarizing. I usually live in the flow,
Yeah, so I would summarize that most people say they want to achieve happiness, but in fact, they're after achievements and possessions, which many times do not make them happy. And it's, in many cases, quite easy for people in the Western societies to be happy because they have all the basics taken care of. So doing certain things that anybody can do, like gratitude exercise you mentioned, meditation, mindfulness training, forgiveness, a vision of the future, getting enough sleep, taking breaks, not overworking, not having information overload, doing physical exercise, doing all these simple things, you are able to achieve a higher level of happiness. So the recommendation is, don't listen to what Western society wants to do, which you think might make you happy. Even don't listen to your natural programming, which only cares about reproductive success, which many times means having more status and possessions. But care, but really think about what is making you happy. Look at examples of people that are happy, like, for example, Buddhist monks, and see that it's not for them the possessions, the status, but it's other things. And especially when we're talking about practices, as well as some other things besides those practices, like, for example, having fulfilling relationships, intimate relationships, having the basic needs being taken care of, and being able to uh, be aware, mindful of our thoughts, and being able to produce more positive thoughts than negative thoughts.
Yeah,
You think that's
perfect.
okay, cool.
Yeah, very good. Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. All right, I'm gonna edit this and then
Okay,
send it to you.
thanks.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.